One of the primary goals of my channel is to take a collection of seemingly unrelated symptoms that regularly manifest in the bodies of those with a chronic ailment and establish the connection between these symptoms, because once you're able to obtain that information, it gives you a much better chance of actually resolving these symptoms for the long term. And although you might be somebody who's dealing with far more significant and restrictive symptoms than the ones that I'm going to discuss in this video, you should never ignore the smaller abnormal signs that your body presents with. And the reason for that is because these smaller signs can actually help to lead you to the origin of the much bigger problem that's manifesting within your body. So let's talk about some of these issues involving our eyes, sinuses and ears, and in particular bloodshot eyes with dilated pupils, dry, congested and restricted sinuses with difficulty breathing, and fullness sensed in the ear with muffled hearing. The first thing that's super important to observe is if you experience these sensations in your right ear, eye or sinus, your left ear, eye or sinus, or both sides equally. And the reason for this is because your nervous system is actually bilateral. What this means is that the cranial nerves that mediate the activity of these sensory organs are two-sided, with innervation coming in from both left and right-sided branches. So that's something that's just very important to pay attention to, especially when it comes to identifying a lesion that could be existing within your nervous system, and whether it's a right or a left-sided issue that actually needs addressing. But that brings me on to what I believe to be the leading culprit behind the continuous reoccurrence of these unpleasant facial-related symptoms. And what that is excessive vasoconstriction of the blood vessels within the head. Because straight away, what comes to mind when you think about bloodshot eyes, blocked sinuses and muffled hearing? Well, what comes to my mind is tightness, constriction, excess pressure, restricted and narrowed pathways, and increased congestion. And these things all impact how easily and freely blood is able to be circulated to and from these sensory organs. If there's something going on within us that is impairing the circulatory system's ability to be able to continuously deliver oxygenated blood, then there's a high likelihood that we'll end up with persistent symptoms within these organs themselves. But why the excess vasoconstriction in the first place? Well, I'll explain that in just a moment in the second half of this video, but if you haven't yet already done so, I highly recommend checking out the Unbeatable Blueprint online course. Here I take you through 5 hours of life-changing content where I discuss the origin behind many long-standing chronic conditions, and I share the exact step-by-step process that I followed that allowed me to significantly improve my overall quality of life. Now, I believe one of the biggest contributors to excess vasoconstriction of the blood vessels existing within our head, and thus leading to the onset of these undesirable sensations, is actually inaccurate sensory information being delivered to the brain on a continuous basis. Sounds confusing, so let me explain. So unconsciously, our body is continuously detecting where it is relative to its surrounding environment. And the way it does this is through 3 primary systems. We have the visual system, the vestibular system, and the proprioceptive system. These 3 systems communicate with one another in a neurological sense to help us form a virtual map of our surroundings. And the main purpose of this is to allow our brain to know where it is relative to its environment, so that it can then in turn get the rest of the body to respond in an appropriate way. This integrated sensory information takes place in the small part of the back of our brain called the cerebellum, which also has a left and a right side to it. And once this information is processed in the cerebellum, it actually crosses over to the contralateral, so the opposite side of the neuraxis, to be sent to the cortex, which are these two large hemispheres at the top of our brain. So for example, if we were to get information coming in through the right cerebellum, it would then in turn cross over to the left cortex. From here, the cortex on that particular side fires down into an area of the brain just beneath it called the basal ganglia, which produces inhibitory neurotransmitters, and the purpose of these is to calm down the area of the brain just beneath it called the midbrain. This all loops right back round to what I was talking about earlier, as one of the key roles of the midbrain is to heighten sympathetic activity throughout the body. And increased sympathetic activity will mean excess vasoconstriction of blood vessels. And when it comes to the head specifically, increased sympathetic activity will go on to activate certain muscles and glands that will interfere with the function of cranial nerves 3, 7 and 8, the ocular, facial and vestibulocochlear nerves, which will go on to significantly impact and cause the eye, ear and sinus issues that I mentioned just a moment ago, because the sympathetic signal will constrict the blood vessels of these muscles and glands that they innervate, which will increase vascular resistance and decrease the ability for oxygenated blood to actually be delivered to these organs to allow them to function optimally. Now, why this phenomenon doesn't occur in the vast majority of fit and healthy people out there is because we have certain inbuilt centers existing within our brain that were specifically designed to keep this whole system under control. As I mentioned a moment ago, the basal ganglia provides certain neurotransmitters that help to suppress the sympathetic activity of the midbrain, similarly to how you'd have a handbrake that would prevent a car from rolling down a hill. Now, issues start to come into play when this tight grip gradually begins to loosen. Certain breakdowns occur within neuronal networks, and this whole system just starts to lose its functional integrity. And this could be as a direct consequence of a concussion, infection, traumatic event, or as a result of a certain substance that you might have ingested. And all of a sudden, without you even being aware of it, the midbrain's hyper-excitable neuronal activity is heightened because it's no longer being kept in check. And as a result, sympathetic activity is allowed to run riot throughout the entire body. In order to truly understand why this is happening though, we have to go right back to the start of this chain reaction of events, where our body is unconsciously taking on board sensory information from its surrounding environment through its visual, vestibular and proprioceptive systems. If the information that these systems are continuously taking on board is accurate and aligns with reality, then we should have no issues whatsoever, because the basal ganglia will be able to provide sufficient amounts of inhibitory neurotransmitters. However, if these systems were to misinterpret or struggle to decode certain aspects of their surroundings, then this whole system would break down and the basal ganglia would lose its hold over the midbrain, leading to heightened vasoconstriction of blood vessels throughout the entire body. So what I'm suggesting that primarily separates those with bloodshot eyes, blocked sinuses, and muffled hearing from the people who don't have to suffer with these ailments is the current state of the sensory division of their peripheral nervous system and how well equipped it actually is to handle its surrounding environment. There is exceptions to this, of course, if you're somebody who suffers with seasonal allergies or you're prone to developing frequent infections. These things can of course go on to contribute to the emergence of these sensations. But I would say if you notice these symptoms appear more so in cold weather environments where you have more constriction occurring in your periphery, or perhaps after you've just come out of a more stimulating environment, then it could be because you have abnormally high amounts of vasoconstriction occurring due to the reasons that I pointed out in this video